From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today we're going to be talking about the recent Iranian internet shutdown and what it means for the future of civil society, both in Iran and the wider region. Joining us remotely from Tunis today is Mahsa Alimardani, an internet researcher focusing on technology and human rights in Iran. She's a doctoral researcher with the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford and works with the human rights organization Article 19. And here in Washington, we're also joined by Mike Sexton, the director of MEI's cyber program. Mahsa, Mike, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Beginning on November 15th, Iran's government imposed an internet blackout across the country, restricting internet connectivity to 5% of normal capacity, according to netblocks.org. The shutdown came amid widespread protests initially sparked by the government's decision to raise fuel prices by 50%. It was the most severe shutdown since President Hassan Rouhani's election and lasted for several days before access was slowly restored. Also, what impact did the internet shutdown have on the protests?
Well, it definitely hindered the free flow of information during the protest, and it definitely hindered, the ability for people to mobilize and, coordinate where they want to meet up. For example, in Tehran, right before the shutdown, people were coordinating on the user-generated navigation app ways to say where to come together to do the protest. So once the internet was shut off, any foreign platform was essentially disconnected, and they were meant to rely on national platforms, which are subject to surveillance and monitoring. So it wasn't that easy to coordinate and very hard for any kind of documentation of, the human rights violations that were occurring. We've heard now the information, after the block was lifted, we've heard about the hundreds of deaths, but it was very hard to understand what kind of shootings and what kind of violent acts were occurring at the time because of this blockade.
So this internet shutdown was historic in terms of the scope for Iran, but it was not without precedent. When has Iran shut down the internet before?
The first time Iran did this was in 2009, approximately 10 years ago, and they shut down the internet for about 45 minutes on the day the election announcements for the presidential re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was coming out. It was a totally different scenario 10 years ago. When they did this shutdown for 45 minutes, they shut down the entire internet infrastructure. So back then, there wasn't this differentiation between national traffic and international traffic. It's now been 10 years since that time they did that, and they've really developed it to the point where they can now differentiate between a national infrastructure. So that national internet infrastructure stayed online while the international traffic was essentially blocked.
Great. We'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But Mike, first, this phenomenon isn't restricted to Iran by any means. We've seen several high-profile cases this year, including in Indian-controlled Kashmir in August, in Iraq in November. Just how common is this across the region and around the world?
It's tough to say because it obviously has happened multiple times, but I would say that it's still not very common, at least not necessarily to the sort of threshold that would really concern journalists as to whether or not they're able to cover things like elections or protests. It's still something that happens somewhat infrequently. But it does appear to be, and I think with this case in Iran, something that can be effective at shutting out the flow of information in and out of a country and could possibly become a trend that's used more often in countries that are seeking to stifle the flow of information.
Mahsa, you referenced it before, the National Information Network, but I wanted to kind of dig into that in a little bit more detail with you. Can you tell our listeners what exactly that is, how it works?
So that's a really good question. I think various academics, activists, researchers have been trying to wrap themselves around this question for the past 10 years. And even now, when government officials come to talk about it, there is some form of vagueness in trying to explain this concept. But Essentially, this concept was conceived all the way back during the administration of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Sometime around 2005, the idea came about, and it was known under different names. It was known as the Shoma Network. It was known as Halal Internet. Halal being that, this type of internet would have moral content. All the immoral content would be kept out of it. And there were different explanations for why they wanted to create this kind of, moral national Iranian internet. Security reasons were brought up. It really started gaining momentum as an idea after Stuxnet, although it was, conceived before it, but, protecting the nation's cybersecurity elements from foreign enemies was a reason given, boosting just national infrastructure and the financial sector through the development of the IT industry and having homegrown technologies and applications. So there's many different ways of thinking of it. You can think of it as a network, but the way that they've been going about building it has been really to nationalize the technology and the infrastructure of the internet. So, for example, the first kind of implementation of the policies was around 2010 when the government required all public institutions to move their website hosting to host inside of the country. And so sanctions also played a part in the story back then because U.S. sanctions at that time meant that no American hosting providers could host any .ir domains. So this was really complementing this national policy at the time. So that was one of the implementations. And then, there's been different iterations of the government providing incentives to developers to provide national messengers that could rival foreign messengers and, giving them bonuses if they manage to attain like over millions of users. There have been certain policies that have been more effective. So, for example, Iran has blocked YouTube, and there is a national alternative to YouTube, which is known as Aparat. And so video streaming naturally requires more use of data, more use of broadband. And so they provide subsidies to people on their, data packages that if they want to use data for Opera, it'll be free or half the price of what it would be to use, international traffic. And so these kind of incentives have been trying to popularize these national alternatives. For the case of national messengers, so like the alternative to Telegram would have been Surush, not very popular, but for the alternative to YouTube, Aparat, it's been quite popular just because of the economic incentives.
Did these services work during the shutoff of the rest of the internet then?
For the most part, they did work, but this was really the first exercise of the entire country being dependent on this national infrastructure. So there were some glitches. So I remember speaking to various contacts and them telling me they weren't able to do their bank transfers on like the Sunday of the internet shutdown, but then afterwards it resumed back to normal. So in essence, yes, it was working fine, but there were some glitches here and there.
Many countries in the Middle East are known to employ internet filtering for materials that are deemed to be inappropriate or politically critical. How does the National Information Network compare to those? Is it similar? Is it different from? Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit more?
There is a global trend of a lot of authoritarian contexts moving towards this concept of a sovereign internet. China has been very successful in doing it. I mean, Russia has been trying to legalize its efforts to do this, but they have implemented policies. So I think China and Russia are kind of exemplar in the fact that they have national platforms that are under the influence, or you could say control, of the government authorities. And so I think China in particular is a model that Iran would like to emulate, which is, their national platforms are hugely popular. WeChat is hugely popular in China. And so this is something they would have liked to emulate. They weren't very successful because none of the national alternatives that they were kind of building that were like WeChat were ever really picked up. No one really trusted in them and no one really used them. They would rather go through the hurdles of getting a circumvention tool to access them than to use the national alternatives.
Mike, how do governments justify shutting down or segmenting their internet from the global internet?
So one justification that we hear kind of crosses this shady boundary between what the United States and Europe considers to be cyber warfare, which is exploit code damaging data somewhere else, and what countries like Russia and China argue falls under that, which is the dissemination of information that is critical of the government or somehow harmful to the harmony of society, is something we hear a lot. So one sort of hypothetical justification for this kind of operation would be, for example, the NotPetya cyber attack in Ukraine and throughout Europe in 2017, or in the case of the cyber attacks against Estonia in, I believe, 2006 or 2007. If a country were able to just sort of flip a switch and shut off all connections from outside the country, then they may be able to contain their country from some sort of very harmful virus that is spreading widely, or from a massive DDoS denial of service attack like the one that took place in Estonia. So that's the sort of hypothetical case where this might make sense as a national security priority. But increasingly, the cases where we've seen governments try to develop this capability at all tend to be authoritarian countries. And so it's difficult to lend credulity to the notion that this is at least what the United States would understand to be in these countries' actual defense.
And what role could another Iranian internet shutdown play in a hypothetical future interstate conflict in Iran, Mike?
So if we were to consider a future scenario where there's a hybrid conflict with Iran and cyber warfare is playing a major component, where Iran is concerned about attacks on critical infrastructure, on electricity or water systems that could seriously do harm to civilians, this kind of shutdown could go far to protect against those kinds of attacks if they were something that was going to be taking place. So to just use the example of Stuxnet, something that was really impressive about Stuxnet was that the nuclear facility, Natanz, that it was injected into was what's called air-gapped. You can't just log into an email in Stuxnet and or send some sort of package online. That actually needed to be hand delivered through a USB. So if you were to create that kind of essential air gap between your national internet and the outside world, it could hypothetically serve as a powerful defense against external cyber attacks.
Mahsa, I'm curious to get your thoughts on the economic impact of all of this as well. Iran was already facing significant economic problems due to the combination of U.S. sanctions under the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, as well as kind of broader, longer-term structural issues. What effect did the internet shutdown have on the economy in Iran?
It had a very significant impact. The government has come out with its own estimates of what kind of losses it had. I think the week that it experienced it, there have been estimates from somewhere around 300 million US a day to $1 billion overall. I'm not sure of the exact figure, but there was serious costs. And we could see this because when they were trying to roll out the return of international internet connections in Iran, I personally found a leaked document that the government had given to the various internet service providers of who the priority actors or points to get reconnected were. And the priority, actors were all kind of economic elements. It was the startups, it was the public institutions, it was the various corporations, and they wanted them to reconnect first. And as, the protests were settling down, and then the rest of the people were. And so the government is very aware of this fact, which is why I think it's beneficial to, pursue for various countries, especially like the EU, who are pursuing means of not economically isolating Iran. I think it's a very positive step towards keeping the internet free and open, because if Iran really wanted to move towards this nationalized kind of infrastructure, it would really need to isolate its economy. And from everything we're hearing from Iran and from all their policies and all the efforts they're putting in place, that isn't the policy they're moving towards. They're very interested in economic trade and relations with the EU, with the rest of the region, and with Asia. And so, not the U.S. policy of trying to economically isolate Iran, I think, will complement their efforts to further nationalize. And it's definitely a narrative element that Iran has taken advantage of. So just today, the Minister of ICT made an announcement about how they need to strengthen the National Information Network, citing the issue of sanctions and what sanctions has done in terms of access to the internet for Iranians. And this is a legitimate point. The overcompliance of U.S. tech companies has meant that key parts of, the global internet infrastructure has become blocked for Iranians. So from various services that are hosted on the Google Cloud platform to Amazon's AWS, even services like free services on Slack are banned for Iranians. So these things are seen as, injustices for access to a free internet. And so the government is really using this as an excuse to legitimize the need for them needing to strengthen their national information network. And at times they're taking it a step too far. It's a line that's been used since the Ahmadinejad era, which is the U.S. is sanctioning us. We don't know if these sanctions are going to lead to them disconnecting the global internet to us. So we need to create an independent internet in the moment that the U.S. decides to use its power to disconnect us from the global internet. So it's a narrative that, has some legitimacy, and the authorities in Iran are obviously, trying to take advantage of it to pursue their own policies.
Great. Mike, you recently interviewed Murtaza Hussain, one of the journalists behind The Intercept's Iran Cable story about the future of journalism in the Middle East. How do internet shutdowns like Iran's affect their work in the region?
Internet shutdowns like Iran's are really sort of the last worst step that governments can take for journalists to be able to reliably cover protests like or just generally stories like what was going on in Iran. I'd asked him specifically about the increasing trend of governments in Iraq and Egypt raiding independent journalists, independent news outlets to investigate people or to detain people. And his take, he was kind of cautiously optimistic that obviously having no independent homegrown journalism in a country makes it very difficult for an outside journalist to be able to reliably cover the country. But as long as there still is some flow of information out, whether it's tweets or some other social media platform, he described preferring to have 1 to 3 independent journalistic outlets over 10,000 tweets. But 10,000 tweets, a journalist can also get their job done covering what's going on the ground. But when you shut it down so there aren't even people getting tweets out, that is really when things get scary.
Mahsa, besides internet regulation, what other tools does Iran use to suppress dissent domestically? And how specifically does that impact the information space, both inside and outside the country?
So over the past 10 years, I've been following internet policy, but just overall monitoring general news from different parts of Iran. I've also noticed that as they have been, strengthening and putting more resources into decentralization of the internet, they've also been, boosting the makeup of the Revolutionary Guards in various provinces, the resources that the Basij or the paramilitary forces get. And so you can kind of see the simultaneous developments that go hand in hand, which naturally means that these forces, which, traditionally are used to suppress dissent within Iran, have new leadership, have more resources. And so, you can see by the way that protests have been suppressed during the past 3 weeks in Iran, how fast and how effective they were. Effective with a lot of violence and deaths. You can see these developments have been going on to, really limit the ability for protest and the right to protest, which is constitutionally enshrined in Iran.
So considering the internet shutdown and the government crackdown that you just referred to, I'm curious as to in light of all that, what your broader perspective is on the future of internet freedom in Iran and kind of civil liberties more broadly.
Well, I mean, from what I am seeing from government officials after the return of the internet, and so this is a administration of Hassan Rouhani that has been very adamant about internet freedom, access to the internet, and not disconnecting Iran from the internet. So it's been really interesting to hear how they're justifying themselves after this really intense and repressive period. And it just seems like they're using vague descriptions of their internet policy to really describe it. So Rouhani spoke on December 8th, and he was saying that the National Information Network needs to be strengthened. And we need to strengthen it to the point that Iranians don't need to rely on international and foreign services or foreign platforms. And then there was massive outrage amongst Iranians. You could see it on social media, even within Iran's own media, to the statement. And his spokesperson had to come in and clarify and say, this doesn't mean that we're disconnecting from the international internet. The international internet is, in fact, part of the National Information Network. These things go hand in hand. So there's this balancing act they're trying to do while pursuing a kind of policy that's, a paradox in itself. You want to nationalize it, but you don't want to disconnect. And so I think what we're going to see is probably, more aggressive policies to get people on these national infrastructures, making the bandwidth much slower for international traffic than for the national traffic, and, providing more and more incentives for people to rely on the national infrastructure.
Great. I think we'll have to leave things there for today. But Mahsa, Mike, thank you both for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.